We can now make use of Java's class loading in the factory pattern. This will allow us to isolate different instances of the types that we create. So what is the factory pattern? The factory pattern is a constructor pattern. And the way it works is something like this. We have an abstract factory. This is an abstract class that defines a factory, and that factory will allow us to create instances of some type. From this, we derive many concrete factories, and it's these actual concrete factories that we use to create the type that we need. Associated with this, we have a corresponding hierarchy of types. So we have an abstract type and the corresponding concrete types. One concrete factory will create one type of thing, another concrete factory will create another type of thing. Within our application code, we'll code against the abstract factory and we'll code against the abstract type. The primary idea behind the factory pattern is that it lets us abstract away the construction of some type. So we don't need to use the name of that type directly in our code. And that makes things like testing easier, for example. So in this project, we have a straightforward implementation of this abstract factory pattern. So here we have an interface called iCamera factory. That's our abstract factory. And that has concrete implementations of Nikon camera factory and Canon camera factory. iCamera factory has a method called createCamera, and that returns an iCamera. The Nikon camera factory returns a new Nikon camera, and the Canon camera factory returns a new Canon camera. Both the Nikon camera and the Canon camera implement iCamera. iCamera has a method called takePhoto, and the Canon camera implements takePhoto and prints out Canon photo taken here, and the Nikon camera also implements takePhoto and prints out Nikon photo taken. And we can see a use of this in the main method here. So inside main, we create a new Nikon camera factory. We call it createCamera method. That's the builder method. That's the factory method itself. And then on the interface, we call takePhoto. And depending on whether we've built a Nikon camera factory here or a Canon camera factory here, it'll print out the appropriate message here. Notice we only code against the interface iCamera factory and the interface iCamera. And if I run this code, we'll see it prints out Nikon photo taken, as you'd expect, as it's using the Nikon camera factory. So there are a couple of things in this code we'd like to fix. The first is that we are hard coding the use of a Nikon camera factory here, and it might be that we'd like to configure that. Along with that, when we deliver this code, we're assuming use of Nikon camera factory at a specific location, something that's on the class path. And it may be we'd like to specify the location of a jar file that contains the code that we're going to use as well. And we can fix both of those problems. The first thing we will do is to use a configuration file. In this case, we'll use a JSON file, and inside that file, we can specify a factory type as a string, and in this case, that will be com.pluralsight.nikon camera factory. And we'll also specify a location where we'll have a jar file, and that jar file contains the code that we'll use. So that will contain the factory code and the implementation code of the concrete type that we want to create. So covering the configuration briefly, I have a configuration class here, and this class is going to read in the name of the config file, extract the contents from that file. We are then going to use the Jackson JSON parser, and that has an object mapper class, and we can use this class to read the configuration information. So we call mapper.readValue to read the data from the contents into the configuration class, and we end up with a location and the factory type. So the code itself will add to this new class called configuration main. This also is a main method. The first thing we need to do here is to load the configuration. So we do that by using our configuration's static load configuration method, passing it arg0. Now I'm doing no error checking here, so I'm assuming that we're passing the name of the configuration file as the first parameter to main. Obviously, normally we would check that code. So I want to be able to use the location specified inside the configuration to load classes. So classes will be loaded from that configuration location. So for that, we need to create a string called location, and make that equal to configuration.getLocation. And then once we have that, we can create a URL, call it URL equals new URL, and that will contain the location we've just specified. So in here, we'll specify location, and that URL is then ready to be used by a URL class loader. So I can now say URL class loader UCL equals new URL class loader, and I can just pass it this array of URLs. So I can say new URL array, and into this, just pass in the URL we've just created. Once we have this URL, we can then load an instance of the factory. And we can do that by using class.forename against the factory name as part of the configuration. So the code will be something like class.forename. And to this, we're going to pass three parameters. We're going to pass the name of the class. So that's in configuration. So configuration.getFactoryType. We want to pass true to say I want this class initialized when it's loaded. And we want to pass this thing, the URL class loader, to be used to load the class, and that's in UCL. Class.forename returns a class, but we can have this type safe, so we can return a class of a specific type. And I want this to return a class of type iCameraFactory. So I can say class iCameraFactory, CLS equals class.forename. We want to provide a cast here, so we place the cast in front. So I now have a factory. Once I have the class, I can now create an instance. So I can say iCameraFactory equals class.newInstance. That lets me create an instance of the factory itself. And then from the instance code, I can then say iCamera equals CameraFactory.createCamera. So we'll now have the camera that we want to use. We can then call the camera's takePhoto method, and that will print out the message to the console. So if I run this by going to run the configuration main, the main inside the configuration main class, then on the console here we'll see Nikon photo taken. So we get the same result, but now this is highly configurable. If we go into config.json and change this from Nikon Camera Factory to Canon Camera Factory and rerun the code, we get Canon photo taken. So a simple change to a configuration file allows us to change the behavior of the application.